In a charged address before the United Nations, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confronted accusations levelled against his country amid the ongoing war in Gaza. His speech was a mix of rebuttals, appeals to history, and sharp criticism of world leaders who, in his words, have rewarded terrorism. At the heart of Netanyahu's address was his response to one of the gravest allegations, genocide. Take the false charge of genocide. Israel is accused of deliberately targeting civilians. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposite is true, he declared, his voice firm as he sought to dismantle the narrative dominating some international debates. To bolster his argument, Netanyahu cited expert opinion. The head of urban warfare studies, Colonel John Spencer, he's perhaps the world's greatest expert on urban warfare, and he says Israel is applying more measures to minimize civilian casualties than any military in history. And because we're doing that, the ratio of non-combatant to combatant casualties is less than 2-to-1 in Gaza. The Prime Minister emphasised that this ratio is astoundingly low, lower than NATO's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, especially when you consider that Gaza is one of the most densely populated urban areas on Earth. Such remarks were clearly intended to counter international criticism over the high civilian death toll in the conflict. Netanyahu argued that Israel was being unfairly targeted by global opinion, despite what he described as unprecedented efforts to protect civilians. He went further to challenge comparisons of Israel's actions to historical atrocities. This charge is so baseless. The comparison to genocide, wholesale slaughter of populations. What did the Nazis ask the Jews to leave? Kindly leave, go out. Did others? You want me to name all the genocidal leaders of history? Just go one by one? Did anyone do this? Did they say, get out so we can come in? Of course not. The Prime Minister invoked history to argue that Israel's calls for civilians in Gaza to evacuate combat zones were evidence of a starkly different intent than that of perpetrators of genocide. His remarks, laden with rhetorical questions, underscored his frustration with accusations that he deemed both unfounded and offensive. Turning to accusations of deliberately starving civilians in Gaza, Netanyahu issued a strong rebuttal. Israel is accused of deliberately starving the people of Gaza. When Israel is deliberately feeding the people of Gaza, if there are Gazans who don't have enough food, it's because Hamas is stealing it. Hamas steals it, hoards it, and sells it at exorbitant prices to fight its war machine. This claim reflected Israel's long-standing argument that aid and supplies sent into Gaza are often diverted by Hamas for military use rather than humanitarian needs. Netanyahu then turned his criticism toward international leaders who recently recognized a Palestinian state, arguing that their decision would have dire consequences. The leaders who recognize a Palestinian state this week sent to the Palestinians a very clear message: murdering Jews pays off. He did not stop there. Addressing those leaders directly, Netanyahu said, "Well, I have a message for these leaders. When the most savage terrorists on earth are effusively praising your decision, you didn't do something right, you did something wrong, horribly wrong. Your disgraceful decision will encourage terrorism against Jews and against innocent people everywhere." The tone of this portion of the speech reflected both anger and disappointment with what Netanyahu described as a dangerous and misguided move by parts of the international community. In one of the speech's more sweeping historical assertions, Netanyahu identified the root cause of the conflict. The persistent Palestinian rejection of a Jewish state in any boundary is what has driven this conflict for over a century. It is still driving it. It's not the absence of a Palestinian state. It's the presence and existence of a Jewish state. He also dismissed promises from Palestinian leaders to reach peace, portraying them as hollow. We've heard these promises for decades. They always promise, they never deliver, because you see, the Palestinian Authority is corrupt to the core. Netanyahu delivered one of the most striking lines of his address as he warned against renewed efforts to create a Palestinian state after the October 7th attacks. Giving the Palestinians a state 1 mile from Jerusalem after October 7th is like giving Al-Qaeda a state 1 mile from New York City after September 11th. This is sheer madness. It's insane, and we won't do it. Addressing Western leaders who continue to push for a two-state solution, he added, "Israel will not allow you to shove a terrorist state down our throats." These words drew applause from some quarters and sharp criticism from others, highlighting the deep divisions that persist over the question of Palestinian statehood. Moving to regional diplomacy, Netanyahu signalled a potential shift in Israel's relationships with some of its neighbours. Today, we have begun serious negotiations with the new Syrian government. I believe an agreement can be reached that respects Syria's sovereignty and protects both Israeli security and the security of the minorities in the region, including the Druze minority. He offered a similar message to Lebanon. Peace between Israel and Lebanon is possible as well. I call on the Lebanese government to also begin direct negotiations with Israel. I commend it for its declared aim to disarm Hezbollah, but we need more than words. If Lebanon takes genuine and sustained action to disarm Hezbollah, I'm sure we can achieve a sustainable peace. The Prime Minister tied Israel's military campaign against Hamas to broader prospects for regional peace. He claimed that many in Gaza had already moved to designated safe zones as Israel continued its offensive against Hamas, and that defeating the militant group could open the door to wider normalization with Arab and Muslim nations. Victory over Hamas will make peace possible with nations throughout the Arab and Muslim world. Our victory would lead to a dramatic extension and expansion of the historic Abraham Accords, which President Trump brokered between Arab leaders and myself 5 years ago. The speech, lasting several minutes, was at times defiant and at other moments conciliatory. Netanyahu sought to balance Israel's hardline military stance with promises of potential diplomatic breakthroughs if certain conditions, primarily the defeat of Hamas and the disarming of Hezbollah, could be met. Observers in the Assembly chamber noted that Netanyahu's words were greeted with a mix of applause, silence, and visible discomfort from some delegations. His historical analogies and direct attacks on Western leaders underscored the strain in Israel's relations with parts of the international community. Throughout his address, the Israeli leader repeatedly emphasized Israel's right to defend itself and rejected narratives that painted it as the aggressor. His appeal was aimed not only at the delegates in the UN hall, but also at the global audience watching the speech unfold. In closing, Netanyahu suggested that the path to peace in the Middle East still lay ahead, but only if the fundamental threats facing Israel were addressed. While he spoke of the potential for peace with Syria and Lebanon, his underlying message remained that the world must not reward violence with political concessions. The address ended with the customary thanks from the Assembly's presiding official. On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. The speech in its entirety painted a picture of a nation determined to defend itself against accusations it sees as unjust, while reaching cautiously toward future diplomatic openings if and only if its core security concerns are met.